So when you think of New York, what actually comes to mind? Towering skyscrapers, the yellow cabs, maybe Wall Street? Well, we're going to have to completely shatter that short-term view right out of the gate. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're tracing an absolutely incredible 13,000-year journey. See, New York isn't just a place. It's a living, breathing cycle of relentless transformation. From its very earliest days to the massive modern metropolis we know today, this is a city that has continuously destroyed and rebuilt its own identity.
And here's our roadmap for today. We'll start off with the first peoples and the city's Dutch roots, move right into the revolution in the early republic, track that massive immigration and industrial growth of the 19th century, then explore the culture and crises of the 20th century, before finally arriving at the modern, resilient metropolis.
All right, let's jump right in. Section 1. First Peoples and Dutch Roots, the origins of a hub.
Long before that iconic concrete skyline ever existed, this whole region was already this thriving hub of human activity. We're talking at least 13,000 years here, literally dating all the way back to the end of the last ice age. Indigenous peoples have inhabited and thrived in this region for millennia. The Lenape, also known as the Delaware, were the primary inhabitants right in the New York City area. They were hunting, fishing, farming across what we now call Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. And the broader region? That was home to the Mohican and the powerful Haudenosaunee up to the north and west.
Then, as you might guess, the pace of change accelerated rapidly during the era of European exploration. In 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian sailing for France, became the very first European to enter the harbor. Jump forward a few decades to 1609, and you've got English explorer Henry Hudson sailing up the river for the Dutch East India Company. By 1624, the Dutch West India Company officially set up shop, establishing New Netherland and founding New Amsterdam right at the southern tip of Manhattan. But actually, the Dutch didn't hold it for long. In 1664, the English swooped in and seized New Amsterdam with surprisingly little resistance, and they renamed it New York, after the Duke of York.
Now, during that brief little Dutch window, back in 1626, a director general named Peter Minuit famously, and I should add, very contentiously, purchased Manhattan from the Lenape. And the price? Goods worth about 60 guilders.
And okay, that brings us to a super famous historical myth. You've almost certainly heard the legend that Manhattan was bought for a mere $24, right? Well, we need to completely bust that myth right now. The actual reality of this transaction between the Dutch and the Lenape was vastly more complex than just some simplified $24 real estate deal.
Moving right along to Section 2, Revolution and Early Republic, a battleground and a capital.
As we step into the late 18th century, New York undergoes this massive identity shift. It goes from a bustling English trading colony, one built partially on the labor of enslaved Africans, it's important to note, straight into the fiery center of a brand new nation. Tensions over British taxes really boiled over here. I mean, the city actually hosted the Stamp Act Congress in 1765 and saw some intense activity from the Sons of Liberty. Then, when the Revolutionary War broke out, the British won the massive Battle of Long Island in 1776. And get this, they actually occupied New York City for the majority of the war. They didn't finally evacuate until 1783, which is when George Washington triumphantly entered the city.
And right after the war, New York had this brief but incredibly important stint as the political heart of America. In 1789, New York City actually served as the very first U.S. capital under the Constitution. Think about that. George Washington was inaugurated as our first president right there at Federal Hall on Wall Street. Eventually, though, the capital shifted over to Philadelphia and ultimately down to Washington, D.C.
Which brings us to Section 3, Immigration and Industrial Growth, the absolute boom of the 19th century.
The 1800s marked the era where the city just physically and demographically exploded. And the catalyst for this massive boom? The Erie Canal. Completed in 1825, this absolute engineering marvel connected the Hudson River directly to the Great Lakes. So why does this matter? Well, it instantly made New York the premier commercial port in the entire United States. It's what fueled the dramatic rise of Wall Street, which, by the way, had founded its stock exchange back in 1792, and it fully locked in New York's status as a financial powerhouse.
And with this huge economic explosion came a massive influx of diverse cultures. The 19th century saw these incredible waves of immigration. First came the Irish and Germans, followed later by Italians, Eastern Europeans, and Jewish immigrants. They literally transformed the fabric of the city, creating that vibrant, incredibly complex melting pot that really defines New York's cultural identity today.
To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this boom, just consider this. Back in 1800, the population in New York was around 100,000.
By 1900, just 1 century later, that number had absolutely skyrocketed into the millions. The speed of this growth is just breathtaking.
But, this growth absolutely wasn't without some intense growing pains. The 19th century was really forged through this mix of devastating crises and monumental achievements. In 1835, you had a Great Fire that destroyed much of Lower Manhattan. Then, during the Civil War, while New York was a key Union supporter, it suffered the incredibly violent and deadly draft riots in 1863. Yet somehow, through literal fire and rubble, it just kept building. The iconic Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, and then in 1898, the modern city of Greater New York was officially created by consolidating the 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. The whole shebang. Now, let's zoom out for just a quick second here, because the broader New York state was simultaneously leading the nation in its own right. Upstate New York was a major pioneer in some crucial social movements. For example, slavery was ended in the state in 1827, and the pivotal Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights took place there in 1848. It was also home to major revolutionary sites like the battles of Saratoga. Basically, the entire state was a crucible of American progress.
Let's move into Section 4, Skyscrapers, Culture, and Crises. The dizzying highs and crushing lows of the 20th century.
So, the 20th century in New York was really defined by these extremes. In the early 1900s, New York undeniably became the cultural and financial capital of the world. We see this legendary skyscraper boom giving us masterpieces like the Woolworth and Chrysler buildings. At the same time, Ellis Island was processing millions of immigrants seeking a new life. And then the 1920s brought the incredible cultural explosion of the Harlem Renaissance. Honestly, the city seems totally unstoppable.
But then came the devastating lows. The 1929 Wall Street crash triggered the Great Depression. Jumping ahead to the post-war era, despite suburbanization and securing the UN headquarters, by the 1970s, the city faced a massive fiscal crisis. It was famously told to drop dead by the federal government and got branded Fear City amidst rolling blackouts and urban decline. The 1980s saw Wall Street start to recover under Mayor Ed Koch, but at the exact same time, the city battled the horrific crack epidemic and the AIDS crisis. Finally, in the 1990s, under Mayor Rudy Giuliani, the city saw a significant drop in crime amid economic improvement. It was just this constant gritty fight to step back from the brink of total collapse.
Which brings us up to Section 5, the modern, resilient metropolis, the 21st century.
If there is a single word to define New York in the 21st century, it is without a doubt resilience. The city's capacity to absorb these massive shocks and systematically answer tragedy with rebuilding is just astonishing. The devastating September 11 terrorist attacks in 2001 killed nearly 3,000 people. But the city showed this unyielding resolve, eventually opening One World Trade Center in 2014. The 2008 financial crisis? That originated partly right on Wall Street, yet the city rebounded with huge tech and finance growth. And even after the natural devastation of Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and the incredibly severe impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, New York firmly remains a global hub for arts, finance, diplomacy, and media. And despite literal centuries of upheaval, wars, fires, riots, pandemics, over 8 million residents proudly call the city proper their home today.
So what does this all mean? What should you really take away from all this? Well, the core identity of New York is its constant reinvention, its unmatched ambition, its deep diversity, and that relentless transformation. From a Lenape homeland to a Dutch trading post, an English colony, a revolutionary battleground, and an industrial powerhouse, New York is not just some static place on a map. It is a living entity that is completely defined by its ability to evolve.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. We've traced an incredible timeline together today. But as we know, history isn't over. After 13,000 years of constant destruction, rebuilding, and transformation, what will New York's next reinvention be? I'll leave you to think about that one. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.